The morning had no color in it. Even the courthouse looked drained, as if the winter sky had leaned down in the night and stolen whatever warmth the building once carried. Salt and old snow crusted the steps. Wind scraped across the square in thin, bitter gusts. Boots clicked, doors slammed, low voices moved through the cold like smoke. And in the middle of that gray morning, beside an old farmer in a worn coat, stood a white mare who looked as though she had already walked through death once and come back thinner. She was still too narrow through the ribs, too sharp at the hips. One hind leg bore the memory of a wound that had almost finished her. Her coat, though cleaner now, still carried the faint dullness of a body that had once been starved of care. But it was not weakness people noticed first. It was the way she watched. Rigid, silent, trembling not from cold but from something older. Sergei Pavlovich Rudnev stood beside her with one gloved hand resting near her neck, not gripping, not restraining. Just there, just enough to remind her that she was not alone. He looked like a man the world had long ago stopped making room for. His coat had been mended at both elbows. His boots were cracked white at the seams from winter salt. His beard was clean but uneven, as if trimmed by habit rather than vanity. He did not carry himself like a man ready for battle. He carried himself like a man who had buried too much to fear one more hard day. Across the square, a black SUV rolled to a stop. Its paint shone even under a dead sky. The driver stepped out first, then another man in a dark coat. Then, finally, slowly, as if the air itself ought to wait for him, Oleg Zhdanov emerged from the back seat. He wore money the way other men wore skin. A charcoal overcoat, leather gloves, a silk scarf tucked neatly at the throat, shoes too polished for a village courthouse in winter. He paused to button his coat, glanced once at the crowd gathering near the steps, and gave them the kind of smile men practiced when they were used to being believed. A few people in the square recognized him. They did not speak his name loudly. Men like Oleg Zhdanov rarely needed volume to make others uncomfortable. He started forward, and that was when the mare changed. The shift was instant, brutal. Her ears snapped flat. Her neck went rigid beneath Sergei's hand. Every muscle in her body locked so hard it seemed to ring through her bones. Her nostrils flared. Her eyes, those pale, wounded eyes that had learned, over weeks, how to soften in Sergei's barn, suddenly filled with raw, animal terror. She knew him, not the way a horse knows a passerby. The deeper way, the body memory way. Yet the kind that lives under the skin long after pain has ended. Zhdanov took another step, then another, smiling still as if this were all a formality. As if the mare in front of him were an object delayed in transit. As if the old man beside her were merely a peasant holding property that had wandered too far uphill. "Well," he said, his voice smooth enough to slide across ice. "There she is." The mare lunged. Gasps cut across the square. She drove forward with shocking force, front hooves striking hard against the frozen ground. A court clerk cried out. Someone stumbled backward on the steps. One of Zhdanov's men cursed and reached for her halter, but Sergei moved faster, not with violence, not with panic, but with the calm of a man who had spent long nights learning exactly what fear felt like in another living creature. "Belyanka." He didn't shout. He barely raised his voice at all, just one word. Soft, roughened by age, full of something money could never counterfeit. "Belyanka." Easy. The mare stopped as if the sound of him had reached a place inside her pain no one else could touch. Her chest heaved. Steam rushed from her nostrils. The fury in her body broke apart in trembling waves. Then, in front of the courthouse, in front of strangers and officials and a man in a perfect coat, she lowered her head and pressed her face into Sergei's shoulder. Not dramatically, not theatrically, desperately. Like something choosing safety before it could be taken away. The square went quiet. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. A woman near the steps, bundled in a quilted blue jacket, whispered what everyone was suddenly thinking. "That horse knows him." No one was sure which him she meant. Zdanov recovered first. Men like him usually did. He smoothed one glove over the other, though the motion was just slightly too quick now, slightly too sharp. "She's agitated," he said. "Injured animals get confused. That proves nothing." Nothing. And he said it lightly, but there was strain beneath the polish now, a small crack in the lacquer. Sergei finally lifted his eyes to him. He had not spoken yet. Not once. He had arrived before dawn, signed what papers he had been told to sign, and waited in silence with the mayor at his side. But now he looked at Oleg Zhdanov the way old trees look at storms, without admiration, without haste, without any illusion that noise makes a man powerful. "She wasn't confused," Sergei said. His voice was quiet. That made it land harder. Zhdanov gave a short smile. "You are a farmer. Let's not pretend sentiment is evidence." No one missed the insult. That was one of his gifts. He knew how to humiliate people in ways that sounded civilized. But Sergei had already lived through the kind of suffering that strips vanity off a man and leaves only bone. The words did not strike where Zhdanov meant them to. They struck somewhere else. They struck the long road behind him, the empty farmhouse. At the second cup, no one used any more. The drawer where a folded scarf still held the shape of a dead woman's life. The hunger he had swallowed in silence. The last coins in his pocket. The first night the mayor had screamed in his barn as if darkness itself had hands. He did not think of himself as brave. That morning, standing in the courthouse square, he did not feel brave either. He felt what lonely people sometimes feel when they finally find one living thing that still needs them. Unmovable. The courthouse doors opened. A clerk stepped outside and called for order. Papers rustled. A deputy moved down the steps. More people gathered near the rail, sensing what villages always sensed fastest, not legal procedure, but moral weather. The shape of a wrong. The possibility of reckoning. Zhdanov turned slightly toward the officials, slipping the smile back on as if it belonged there naturally. "This has gone on long enough," he said. "That horse is mine. She was unlawfully retained after an unauthorized transfer. I've brought registration copies, valuation records, and prior ownership documentation. I'm sure the court would prefer facts over peasant theatrics." That word hung in the air like spit. One of the deputy clerks looked down. Another shifted uncomfortably. Even people who said nothing felt it, the old ugly instinct of wealth trying to rename cruelty as order. Sergei's hand remained near Belyanka's neck. The mare stayed close against him, but her eye never left Zhdanov. That was what made the moment unbearable to watch. Not fear alone. Recognition. There are injuries the body forgets, and there are injuries it keeps, storing them in muscle, in pulse, in the split second between seeing danger and surviving it. Belyanka remembered. Somewhere beyond the square, a church bell sounded the hour. The noise drifted thinly across the frost. For a brief second, if the whole morning seemed suspended between two truths, the one written on paper and the one trembling alive in front of everyone. Then a new voice entered the silence. Female, clear, controlled. "Your Honor," she said, stepping up from the lower path with a folder tucked under one arm, "before this proceeds any further, the court needs to hear one more fact." Heads turned. Dr. Daria Volkova moved through the gathered crowd with the brisk focus of someone who had stopped caring long ago whether powerful men found her inconvenient. Her boots were muddy. Her hair had come loose beneath her wool hat. Her face carried the sleepless strain of a woman who had spent half the night chasing records that did not want to be found. She stopped near Sergei and the mayor. Then she looked straight at the judge. The wind lifted a corner of the folder in her hand, and when she spoke again, the morning seemed to tighten around every word. "That horse was scanned," Daria said. "Her microchip is active." Zhdanov's face changed. Only a little. But enough. Daria opened the folder. Her registered identity, she said, is not Belyanka. She let the silence deepen first. Let the square lean in. Let the truth arrive with teeth. Her microchip identifies her as Lyrica. Before the courthouse, before the papers, before the black SUV and the polished lie, there had been a farmhouse so quiet it almost seemed to apologize for still standing. It sat at the far edge of the village where the road narrowed, where fences leaned, where winter stayed longer than it should. The roof had been patched so many times it no longer looked repaired. It looked endured. The porch steps dipped in the middle. The wind found every crack in the boards. And at dawn, when the frost clung white to the bare trees and the fields looked like they had been emptied of mercy, the house made the same small sounds it always made. A kettle beginning to whisper, a chair leg scraping the floor, one cup set on the table. Only one. When Sergei Pavlovich Rudnev moved through that silence with the care of a man who had lived with grief long enough to stop calling it grief. He no longer argued with the emptiness. He had made peace with its habits. He knew which floorboard clicked near the stove. He knew which window frame shivered when the north wind rose. He knew exactly how much wood he had left, how much grain remained in the bin, how many days a man could stretch cabbage and potatoes before hunger stopped feeling temporary and started feeling like company. The house had once belonged to two people. You could still tell. Not because there were many things left. Time had thinned the place the way winter thinned a horse. But what remained stayed with purpose. A folded scarf on the peg by the door. A chipped ceramic bowl no one used anymore. A faded photograph tucked into the corner of a mirror. In it, a younger Sergei stood beside a woman whose smile had the rare softness that could make a hard life feel chosen. Her name had been Anna. Even now, years after the ground had closed over her, Sergei never said her name carelessly. He treated it the way some men treated prayer. That morning, he opened the drawer by the stove and looked, as he always did, at the three things inside. The scarf, the photograph, and the folded receipt from the stonecutter in town. A proper grave marker costs more than this, the receipt had once told him without saying the words. He had meant to replace the rough wooden cross before the first winter, then before the second, then before the third. But roofs leaked, chickens died, feed went up, the old plow axle split, and sorrow, unlike debt, never sent notices. It simply waited its turn. Sergei closed the drawer gently. There were 6 coins on the table. He counted them twice, not because the number would change, only because poor men sometimes perform little rituals against hopelessness. 6 coins. Enough for bread, maybe salt, maybe lamp oil if he bargained. Not enough for anything that could honestly be called relief. He slipped the coins into his coat pocket and reached for his cap. Outside, the morning was hard and pale. Frost silvered the fence posts. His breath came white. Somewhere in the bare orchard behind the house, a crow called once and then went quiet. Sergei crossed the yard slowly, boots pressing into frozen mud, and paused near the old barn. The doors sagged on their hinges. One upper board had split clean through. The roof over the south side needed patching before spring rains came. He stood there for a moment, looking at it, not with plans exactly, but with the same weary accounting he applied to all things still left in his care. Then he turned toward the road and began the walk to the village market. He did not walk like a man expecting anything good. That was the other thing grief had done to him. It had not made him bitter. Bitterness required energy. What it had made him was careful. Careful with money. Careful with hope. He was careful with the dangerous little instinct that still whispered once in a while that something might yet arrive which would ask him to feel alive again. By the time he reached the first cluster of market stalls, the village had begun its usual noise. Wheels rattling over thawed ruts. Voices carrying across cold air. A child laughing somewhere near the cabbage cart. Men in work coats speaking in low bursts around crates and feed sacks. The market smelled of turnips, damp wood, livestock, smoke from cheap tobacco, and fresh bread. Warm bread. The smell found Sergei immediately. He followed it without meaning to. The bread stall stood near the square's center, a simple wooden table under canvas, with loaves stacked in rows so golden and plain they looked almost holy against the gray morning. The woman behind the stall knew him. Most people did. She gave him the kind of nod villagers gave the proud poor kind, but not pitying unless invited. "Morning, Sergei." "Morning?" He stopped in front of the smallest loaf. Not the large rye, not the braided one someone richer might take home with cheese and soup. Just the small round loaf with a dark crust and flour still dusted at the seam. His hand came out of his pocket. 2 of the 6 coins settled into his palm. He picked up the loaf. It was still warm. For one dangerous second, the warmth spread through his fingers and almost undid him. Because hunger was never just hunger when a person lived alone. Sometimes it was the memory of being expected home. Sometimes it was the memory of someone cutting bread across from you. Sometimes it was the humiliation of realizing how badly you wanted one ordinary comfort. He stood there too long. The vendor waited without pressing him. Then Sergei's gaze shifted, not to anything in front of him, but inward, toward the drawer at home, the cracked barn roof, the stonecutter's receipt, the steady shrinking of what remained. He looked down at the loaf again. Then, with a care so quiet it hurt to watch, he set it back. The woman blinked. "You sure?" Sergei nodded once. Later. But he was not saving the money for himself. That was what made the moment heavier than hunger. Even before fate had a face, even before the mayor. Something in him had already chosen deprivation as a form of decency. Already decided that if suffering came asking, he would be the one to step aside and let it eat first. As he turned from the stall, a voice called after him from near the onion crates. "Sergei, you need to eat." It was Yelena Makarova, wrapped in a blue quilted coat, her scarf tied tight beneath her chin. She was a widow, too, though a louder one. The kind who survived by refusing to let silence own the whole day. She sold eggs in winter, seedlings in spring, gossip in all seasons. "Later," Sergei said again. She studied his face for a second longer than most people dared. You've said later to half your life." There was no malice in it. That was why it landed. Sergei gave the faintest shrug, the kind men wore when they had no wish to explain wounds no one else could heal. Then he walked on, toward the far edge of the market, toward the part where the noise changed. The neat stalls gave way first, then the cloth awnings, then the baskets of food and practical trade. Out there, near the livestock section, everything felt rougher, less arranged, more honest in its ugliness. Mud churned black under boots. Ropes dragged, cages rattled. Animals shifted in cramped pens. Men haggled too loudly. Someone laughed with the dead tone of a man trying to sell what should never have been sold. Sergei did not usually linger there. He had seen enough bad bargains in life to recognize the smell of desperation when it was tied to a post. Still, he kept walking. That was the strange part. Not curiosity. Not intention, just a pull. Thin at first, then sharper. As if somewhere beyond the last row of feed sacks and wagons, something wounded had already begun to call his name in a language he had not spoken since Anna died. He passed a pen of goats, a mule with one clouded eye, a cart stacked with broken harness leather, 2 boys arguing over the price of a lame rooster, a trader swearing at a buyer. The farther he went, the fewer decent animals he saw. What remained at the edge of the market was not what people came proudly to sell. It was what they hoped someone else would take responsibility for. The sky lowered, the wind turned. A frayed strip of tarp cracked overhead like a whip. Then Sergei heard it. A man's voice, harsh, impatient, stripped of all pretense. "No one's buying that one. She's already dead." The words cut clean through the market noise. Sergei stopped, not because he wanted to, because something inside him did. A few people stood ahead near the far corner, where the fence line bent and the mud turned darker from melted snow and old neglect. But none of them stood close. They were gathered in the shape people make when they want to look without being responsible. One man spat, another snorted. A woman with a basket shook her head and moved on. Sergei could not yet see the animal, only the posture of those around it, the dismissal, the impatience, the familiar human talent for deciding a life was finished before it actually was. He took one more step, then another, and though he did not know it yet, though he could not possibly have known, the quiet road of his life had already ended. The farmhouse, the empty cup, the bread he had not bought, the coins in his pocket, the old grief he had learned to carry like weather. All of it was about to be interrupted by a pair of eyes in a forgotten corner of the market, eyes that looked the way his own had looked after Anna's funeral. Not angry, not pleading, just emptied out by too much pain. Sergei came to the edge of the crowd and finally saw her. The white mare stood tied beneath a warped section of fence, thin as winter hunger, one hind leg wrapped badly, her ribs visible under a coat that should once have gleamed like snow in sunlight. No one standing there believed she had a future, and that was exactly why Sergei could not look away. The mare did not lift her head when Sergei first stepped into view. That was the first thing that struck him. Not the bones, not the bad wrap on the hind leg, not even the way the rope had been tied too short, as if whoever left her there had not bothered to imagine she might want to shift her weight against the pain. It was the absence of hope. Animals usually looked, even frightened ones, even angry ones. They tracked movement, they measured danger, they searched for some scrap of advantage inside a cruel world, but this mare stood with the stillness of something that had already looked for mercy and stopped expecting it. Around her, the market kept making its ugly little noises. A man coughed phlegm into the mud. Someone behind Sergei laughed at a price dispute over a crate of chickens. Harness metal clinked. Boots dragged. A horse farther down the lane stamped in irritation. Life went on. That was what made certain kinds of suffering feel obscene. The fact that the world could continue moving so normally around it. Sergei stepped closer. The mare was white, or had once been. Dirt had yellowed her coat. Dried sweat had left gray shadows along her neck and flank. Her ribs showed plainly. Her hip bones pushed sharp beneath the skin. Her mane hung in tangled ropes, hacked short in places, ripped out in others. One hind leg was wrapped in stained cloth that had slipped loose near the fetlock, exposing swelling and the dark edge of an older wound beneath. The seller stood several feet away, hands tucked under his arms for warmth, face red from wind and indifference. He was not a true horseman. Sergei could tell that at once. He had the look of a man who moved damaged things from one place to another and called it business. "She won't last," the seller said before Sergei asked anything. "You can see that with both eyes closed." Sergei did not answer. He kept looking, because underneath the damage something was wrong with the picture. Not wrong in the ordinary way. Wrong in the expensive way. The mare's head was too fine. The arch of the neck too clean even in starvation. The shoulder too well laid back. The bone too elegant. Even ruined, she carried some surviving geometry of breeding that did not belong in this corner of a village market among broken tack, weak livestock, and things people hoped would disappear cheaply. A woman, passing with a sack of turnips, slowed down just long enough to mutter, "Poor creature," then moved on before pity could cost her anything. The seller spat into the mud. "She came in yesterday, didn't eat much, didn't bite, didn't kick, just stands there." He jerked his chin toward the mare. "That's the worst sign. The quiet ones are finished." Still, Sergei said nothing. He saw more as he moved around her. A scar line near the corner of the mouth, faint but unmistakable old friction, not from a plow harness, not from farm work. Finer, repeated. The kind left by equipment used on trained, high-value horses. The hooves, though overgrown now, had once been trimmed by someone who knew what symmetry cost. There was an old rubbed patch near the shoulder where a blanket had likely sat for long transport. Even her ears, despite the tension in them, showed the reflexes of an animal long accustomed to commands, handling, routine. She had not been born here, and she had not fallen this far by accident. Sergei took another step until he stood near enough to hear the mare breathe. It was shallow, careful, the breathing of a body trying not to feel its own injuries all at once. Only then did she look at him. Her eyes were pale and dulled by exhaustion, but not empty in the way people thought. Not really. The emptiness was only on the surface. Beneath it lay something worse. Memory. There are wounds that bleed outward, and there are wounds that retreat deep into the body and wait there, teaching every nerve to be suspicious of hands, voices, proximity, sudden motion, kindness offered too quickly. The mare's gaze met Sergei's for a fraction of a second and then shifted away, as if even that small exchange required more strength than she could spare. Behind him, someone said, "If you're thinking of buying her, old man, you'd be better off burning the money to stay warm." A few men chuckled. Sergei ignored them. He had spent enough years around fields and weather to know how often the loudest men in a crowd knew the least about what was standing in front of them. He held out his gloved hand, slowly, low enough not to threaten. "Easy," he murmured, though he had no right yet to ask such a thing of her. The mare flinched. Not dramatically. Just enough. A ripple through the shoulder, a tightening around the eye, a tiny backward shift that sent pain up the injured leg. She caught herself instantly and went still again. That flinch told Sergei more than any paper could have. Fear, yes, but trained fear. Fear with a history. He lowered his hand, then tried again, slower now, letting her see each inch of movement. His voice stayed low, roughened by cold and age and the habit of speaking mostly to animals and ghosts. "No one's making you do anything." The seller snorted. "She doesn't understand poetry." Sergei finally looked at him. "No," he said, "but she understands tone." The men nearby quieted a little after that. The seller shifted, mildly annoyed that the old farmer had not played his expected part. "Look, if you want truth, here it is. She's useless. Came through men I don't ask questions of. Injuries bad, fever maybe. If she lives, I'll be shocked. If she dies, I won't refund you." That sentence mattered more than he knew. Came through men I don't ask questions of. Sergei turned back to the mare. He saw the rope burn under the halter, the patchy dried mud up her legs, as if she had been moved in poor conditions, the crust at the edge of the wound wrap where blood had seeped and dried and seeped again. He smelled infection under the market filth, not full rot yet, but close enough to be dangerous. He also saw one more thing. The mare was not leaning on the fence to rest the bad leg. She was keeping herself upright by force. That kind of stubbornness did not come from livestock bred only to endure. It came from something that had once lived under expectation. Pressure, performance, repetition. A life where collapse had not been permitted until it was too late to matter. "How much?" Sergei asked. The seller blinked. Whether from surprise or greed, Sergei could not tell. You serious? How much?" The seller named a number that was lower than the mare deserved and higher than a dying animal should have fetched. A number chosen not by fairness, but by calculation, the exact amount a compassionate fool might still be persuaded to regret. Sergei slipped his hand into his coat pocket. The coins felt colder now. He counted them once against his palm. Not enough. Of course not enough. For a brief second, the market noise dimmed and he saw the plain facts as cleanly as winter light. His roof still needed patching, his pantry was nearly bare, and the bread he had left behind would not be there when he passed back through. Buying this horse would not be charity. It would be an act of irrational loyalty to something that might die in his barn before dawn. He should have walked away. Any practical man would have. But practicality had not sat beside Anna's bed at the end. Practicality had not lowered her into the frozen ground. The practicality had not filled the second chair in the years after. There are moments when the soul recognizes itself in another ruined thing, and all arithmetic becomes too small to matter. Sergei drew out the coins. The seller frowned. "That's short." Sergei added a folded note from the inner pocket of his coat money meant for lamp oil and salt, saved and resaved until it had gone soft at the edges. Still not enough. Yelena's voice came from behind him. "Sergei." He did not turn. She stepped closer, saw the mare clearly, and for once the easy commentary left her face. "Oh, God." Sergei kept his eyes on the seller. "I'll bring the rest by evening." The seller gave a dry laugh. "I don't extend mercy." "No," Sergei said. "I can see that." A pause. Then Yelena, muttering under her breath as if angry at herself for being exactly who she was, reached into her coat and pulled out 2 crumpled bills. "Don't thank me," she said. "I already know this is a terrible idea." Sergei looked at her then. It was not a dramatic look. Just tired gratitude passing silently between 2 people who understood that sometimes decency made fools of everyone involved. He took the money. The seller counted it, licked a thumb, counted again, then shoved the rope toward Sergei with the casual carelessness of a man handing off a sack of grain. The mare's eye flicked sharply at the motion. Her whole body tensed. Sergei took the rope, but not the seller's energy. He did not jerk, did not demand. He stepped near her shoulder and waited until she registered that the hands had changed. "It's all right," he said. She did not believe him. Not yet, but she listened. That was enough for the moment. Near the livestock trucks, half hidden behind a rusted side panel, a man in a dark cap had been watching longer than anyone noticed. Broad shoulders, cheap gloves, the stillness of someone who understood he did not belong enough to attract attention. When Sergei took the rope, the man pulled out his phone, raised it once and snapped a picture. Then he typed a short message. Got a buyer, old farmer, took the mare, he sent it. Far away from the market, in a warmer office where lies were kept in folders and polished wood, a man would soon read those words and feel the first cold irritation of a problem not dying on schedule. But in the market, Sergei knew none of that yet. He knew only the weight of the rope in his hand, the fragility at the end of it, the strange, unreasonable certainty that, if he walked away now, something in him would not survive the leaving. He bent slightly and looked at the mare again. "You need a name," he said quietly. Yelena gave him a look. "You named her already? She shouldn't go home nameless." Home. And the word entered the space between him and the mare before either of them was ready for it. He studied the muddied white of her coat, the ghost of what she had once been, and chose the gentlest thing he could think of. Belyanka. Little white one. The mare's ears moved, only a fraction. But Sergei saw it. Not acceptance, not comfort, just the faintest signal that the sound had reached somewhere inside the fog of pain. He took one careful step forward, then another. The mare hesitated, shifted weight onto the injured leg, and nearly faltered. Sergei stopped immediately. Waited, let her find the balance herself. When she moved again, it was with the miserable, stubborn determination of something too proud to lie down where others could watch. The road home felt longer with every step. Market noise faded behind them. The wind sharpened in the open stretch beyond the last houses. Mud clung to Sergei's boots. How twice Belyanka stumbled. Once she froze at the rattle of a passing cart and went so rigid Sergei thought she might bolt despite the injury. But she did not. She only shook, breath steaming, then moved when he spoke. By the time his farm came into view, the daylight had gone thin and metallic. The barn looked even poorer than usual. A slumping roofline. A gate hung slightly crooked, boards weathered soft by too many winters. The place had no right receiving a horse like this, whatever she had been, wherever she had come from. And yet, when Sergei opened the stall and spread fresh straw with hands already stiff from cold, the barn held one advantage all the fine places in the world had failed to give her: safety, or the first humble draught of it. He brought warm water. She sniffed it, suspicious, then drank in short, guarded pulls. He cut away the filthy wrap from her leg and saw the wound properly for the first time. Yelena, who had followed despite claiming she wouldn't, sucked in a breath. Sergei. The injury was worse than the market had shown, swelling from hock to pastern, heat pulsing under the skin. A jagged tear, half-closed wrong, with the angry redness of neglect. Not fresh, not treated. Whatever had happened to her had happened days ago, maybe longer, and someone, somewhere, had looked at that damage and decided she was cheaper to discard than to save. Sergei heated water, found clean cloth, mixed the first of the dried herbs his father had once used on working animals when money was scarce and roads were far. He worked slowly, speaking to her the whole time, never pretending it wouldn't hurt. When the cloth touched the wound, Belyanka exploded. Not forward, not outward, back into memory. She threw her head high, eyes rolling white, body slamming against the stall rail with a violence too large for her weakened frame. The bucket overturned. Water splashed across the straw. Yelena cried out and jumped back. Sergei barely avoided the flying hoof as the mare twisted, not attacking the barn, not attacking him. Fighting something else, something only she could still see. "No one's making you," Sergei said, voice low but urgent. "No one here. Easy. Easy." But the terror had her now. Her breathing came in sharp, frantic bursts. Her good front hoof hammered the floor. She pressed herself into the corner as if trying to escape a room inside her own body. It was not the wound causing that panic. It was memory. The kind memory leaves in flesh after cruelty has repeated itself often enough. And, standing in the straw-strewn stall of a failing farm, with cold water soaking into his boots and a half-starved mare shaking like a living ghost in front of him, Sergei understood something with absolute, irreversible clarity. This horse had not simply been abandoned. Someone had tried to erase her. The first week, Belyanka did not trust the bucket. She watched it as if water itself had once betrayed her. Sergei set it down and stepped back. No sudden movements, no pressure, no hand on the halter, just the bucket, the clean straw, the quiet, and the old farmer standing far enough away to let her decide whether kindness was another trap. For several seconds she did nothing. Then, with the caution of something that had survived by doubting everything, she lowered her head and took one short pull. Stopped, listened, took another. By the third drink the sound had changed. No longer fearful, no longer rehearsed. It became what it should always have been, an animal answering the body's oldest need. Yelena stood in the barn doorway with her arms folded tight against the cold and pretended not to be moved. "She drinks like she doesn't believe it's hers," she said. Sergei did not answer right away. His eyes stayed on the mare. "She's learning," he said at last. But the truth was harsher than that. She was not learning water, she was relearning safety. That first week was a war measured in inches, not a dramatic war, not the kind men bragged about in taverns or recounted in public like proof of their own character. This war was smaller and harder, a war of warm cloths and sleepless nights, a war of fever checks in the dark, a war of seeing how much swelling had gone down by morning and pretending not to notice when it had not. A war of saving each strip of clean bandage as if linen itself were wealth. Sergei fought it with the only weapons he had ever trusted: patience, routine, and hands that never lied. He cleaned the wound twice a day, heated water on the stove until the kettle whispered, crushed dried herbs from old bundles kept in jars above the pantry shelf: plantain leaf, chamomile, Comfrey root, whatever his father had once used when winter roads were blocked and money was a rumor. Daria, when she came, brought proper salve and sharper instructions. But even she, educated and practical, could not dismiss what she saw in Sergei's care. "You've kept her from infection this long," she said one afternoon, kneeling by the hind leg as pale light filtered through the barn slats. "Most people would have lost her already." "Most people didn't buy her," Sergei said. Daria glanced up at him. There was no pride in his voice. Only fact. The mare shifted under their hands but did not strike. That alone felt like a miracle too modest to call itself one. Her fever had eased. The angry heat in the leg had begun, reluctantly, to retreat. She was still thin enough to make the heart recoil, still moved like each step had to be negotiated with pain. But the body that had arrived at Sergei's farm prepared to surrender had begun, against all probability, to argue for its own survival. And with survival came small revelations. Belyanka liked the stall door left half open in the morning so she could see the yard. She hated the sound of chains dropped suddenly on wood. She startled at men's voices more than women's. If Sergei approached too quickly from the left, she went rigid before she even turned her head. If he spoke first, she held. If he sang, quietly and badly, under his breath while he worked, her breathing slowed. By the second week, the barn no longer felt like a place where death was waiting politely in the corner. It felt like a place under negotiation. Snowmelt began to drip from the eaves in the warmer hours. Sunlight, weak but persistent, struck through the cracks in the boards and laid bright stripes across the straw. The smell changed, too. Less blood, less rot, more hay, more wood smoke from the house, more life, stubborn and ordinary. Once, just after dawn, Sergei came in with fresh water and found Belyanka already standing at the stall door, watching for him. Not pacing, not panicking. Waiting. That nearly undid him. Because there are moments that do not look like redemption to anyone passing by. No choir, no grand revelation, no dramatic music. Just an old man in a cold barn realizing that a creature who had every reason to fear the world had started listening for his footsteps. He set the bucket down and rested one hand lightly against her neck. For the first time, she leaned into it. Only a little, barely more than the weight of a breath. But it was a choice. And Sergei, who had long ago forgotten how much power there was in being chosen by something wounded, stood very still so he would not frighten the moment away. That was the heart of it. Not the wound healing, not the fever breaking, not even the food finally staying in her body. Trust. Slow, irrational, hard-earned trust. Yelena saw it too. She arrived most mornings now under the excuse of bringing eggs or onions or things Sergei had not asked for and could not easily refuse. She had appointed herself witness to the situation, which was how lonely decent people loved one another in villages like theirs, sideways, without ceremony. "Well," she said one morning as Belyanka took chopped mash from Sergei's hand, "look at that. She likes you more than half the people in this village do?" Sergei gave the faintest snort. "That's because she has sense." But even as he said it, he was smiling. Only with one side of his mouth. Only for a second. Still, Yelena saw. So did Daria, when she returned 3 days later with a scanner in her bag and worry hidden badly under professionalism. The sky that afternoon was low and colorless. Wind dragged along the road in restless bursts. From the kitchen window, Yelena, who had once again stayed longer than she claimed she would, noticed a dark vehicle slow near the gate. Not stop. Just slow, then continue on. She frowned. "You expecting someone?" Sergei looked up from the table where he was trimming old bandage cloth into clean strips. "No." Yelena kept watching until the black car disappeared down the road. It was not a local car. Too clean, too dark, too polished for someone who lived among fields and thawing mud. "That's the second time this week," she said. Sergei's hands paused. "What is?" That car. He stood, crossed to the window, and looked out at the empty road now lying innocent beyond the fence. Nothing there. Just the rut-marked lane, the leaning gate, the dull field beyond. But sometimes danger does not announce itself with presence. Sometimes it announces itself by measuring distance, learning routines, checking whether a latch is old, whether a man lives alone, whether a horse that was supposed to die has inconveniently gone on breathing. Sergei said nothing. But from then on, when evening came, he checked the barn lock twice. Darya arrived near sunset, boots muddy, scarf half loose, carrying the sort of tension that enters a room before a person speaks. She greeted Sergei briefly, then went straight to the stall. Belyanka watched her with alert suspicion. "Still not fond of doctors," Darya murmured. "She's learning to tolerate you," Sergei said. "That might be the kindest thing anyone said to me all month." Darya ran practiced hands down the mare's neck, shoulder, leg, checked the wound, pressed gently around the swelling, nodded once, tight with guarded approval. "She's stronger." "Some." "No," Darya said, glancing at Sergei. "More than some." Then she reached into her bag. Sergei frowned at the device in her hand. "What's that?" "A microchip scanner." Yelena, hovering near the stall like a woman who absolutely intended to mind her own business while doing nothing of the kind, frowned. "A what?" Darya stood. "If a horse of any real value is registered properly, there may be an ID chip. Usually in the neck, not always. But with her..." She looked again at the mare's build, the fine head, the lines starvation hadn't completely destroyed. "With her, I'd be surprised if there wasn't." Sergei glanced toward Belyanka. Something in him tightened, because he had seen it too, though he had not named it. The signs that did not belong to this life. The traces of former precision. The expensive shape hidden under ruin. Darya moved the scanner slowly along the left side of the mare's neck. Nothing. She tried again, higher. Still nothing. Yelena exhaled. "Maybe she's just a horse, Darya." Darya didn't answer. She walked around to the other side. The scanner passed once beneath the mane. Twice. Then it gave a sharp electronic chirp. Everything in the stall seemed to stop. Darya froze, looked down at the screen. For a second, the only sound was Belyanka's breathing and the wind tapping a loose board somewhere near the roofline. "Well?" Yelena asked. Darya did not answer right away. That silence was the first bad sign. She scanned again. Same result. Then again, as if hoping the machine might change its mind. It didn't. Sergei felt the temperature in the barn shift, though the cold remained exactly the same. "What is it?" he asked. Darya lifted her head slowly. "Sergei." She hesitated, and hesitation did not suit her. "This isn't some forgotten village mare." He looked at Belyanka, at the narrow white face, the old fear in the eye, the body slowly returning from the edge of extinction. "Who is she?" Darya read from the screen. Registered name. Lyrica. The name fell strangely in the barn. Too polished, too distant, too elegant for the rough wood, the patched blankets, the old farmer who had spent his last money to keep her alive. Breed classification, Darya continued, voice quieter now. English thoroughbred, and high-value bloodline registration attached. Yelena gave a low, disbelieving laugh. "You're joking." Darya looked up. "I'm not." Sergei's gaze stayed on the mare. Lyrica. Not Belyanka. A name from another life. Another world. A world of papers, money, ownership, and whatever machine had chewed her up and thrown her into a market corner to vanish. "Owner of record," Darya said. She stopped again. This time even Yelena didn't push, because some truths announce themselves in the body before they are spoken aloud. Darya swallowed once. Oleg Zhdanov. The stall went still. Outside, the wind moved across the yard in a long, dry sweep. Yelena was the first to react. "Zhdanov," she said. "The businessman, the one with the transport companies and those racing people in the city?" Darya nodded once. "The same." Sergei said nothing. He did not know the man personally, but he knew the type. The men who arrived in villages only when land, profit, or silence was involved, and the men whose names moved ahead of them like weather warnings. Darya looked back at the screen, then at the mayor, then back again. "This makes no sense." "It makes too much sense," Yelena said darkly. Darya's mind was already moving faster now. Sergei could see it. The trained part of her that linked fact to fact, document to document, wound to wound. A horse like this doesn't end up half dead in a village market unless somebody wanted her erased, she said. Sergei felt those words strike somewhere deep because they matched what he had understood the first night in the barn, before proof had language. Not abandoned. Erased. Darya packed the scanner away, but not the tension. "I need to check records," she said. "Registry entries, veterinary filings, ownership history, insurance, if I can get access." "Insurance?" Sergei repeated. Darya met his eyes. A horse with this bloodline could be insured for a lot of money. Yelena's face hardened. "So, if she was declared lost, or declared dead," Darya said. No one finished the thought aloud. They didn't need to. The shape of it was already in the room. A rare horse. A severe injury. A false ending on paper. A remote market where dying things disappeared. A black car slowing near the gate. Belyanka Lyrica shifted in the straw and rested her muzzle briefly against the stall rail, as if none of the human language mattered compared to the simpler fact that she was tired. Sergei stepped closer and laid a hand against her neck. It no longer mattered what another world had named her. In his barn, she had fought her way back as Belyanka. In his barn, she had been thirsty, frightened, feverish, and brave. In his barn, she had chosen not to die. Darya moved toward the door, already halfway into the next problem. "Lock everything tonight," she said. "And if you see that car again, write down the time." Sergei nodded. Yelena, for once, did not try to make light of anything. The daylight was nearly gone when Darya left. The blue dusk settled over the yard. The barn turned colder. Somewhere in the village a dog barked once, then twice, then stopped. Sergei fed the stove, checked the latch on the front door, checked the barn lock, then checked it again. When he came back from the yard, something white lay on the kitchen table. He had not seen it there before. An envelope. No stamp, no sender. Just his name written in a hand too neat to belong to anyone from the village. Sergei stood still for a moment, every instinct in him quieting into attention. Then he picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single sheet. Formal wording. Legal tone. Cold enough to feel expensive. Return the horse immediately. Failure to comply will result in legal action. Yelena read over his shoulder and whispered, "They move fast." But Sergei was no longer looking at the paper. He was looking past it, toward the barn, toward the mayor who had arrived nameless, half dead, and unwanted only to become, with one scan, something dangerous to powerful people. Darya's voice returned to him with new weight now. If he collected insurance, then this horse is evidence. And in the sudden silence of the kitchen, Sergei understood that saving Belyanka had already become more than an act of pity. It had become a threat. The first time Oleg Zhdanov came to Sergei's farm, he did not arrive like a man worried. He arrived like a man offended. The black SUV rolled through the village at noon, too clean for the thawing roads, too polished for a place where mud climbed halfway up every ordinary tire. Children noticed first, then women at the well, then men mending fence lines who straightened without admitting they were watching. By the time the vehicle turned onto Sergei's lane, half the village already understood the truth in the oldest way villages ever understood truth. Power was coming in person. Sergei was in the barn when he heard the engine. He had been changing Belyanka's wrap, working slowly because the wound no longer burned the way it had in the beginning but still stiffened in cold weather. The mare stood with patient tension, her head low, with her breathing steady enough to soothe him by now. That steadiness mattered. She still startled at some sounds, still watched every doorway, still carried memory under the skin. But inside Sergei's barn she had begun to believe not in the world, not yet, but in sequence. Warm water, gentle hands, his voice, morning and evening, pain that passed, hunger answered. No blows, no shouting, no disappearing. When the engine sound rolled across the yard, that fragile trust shivered at once. Her head came up hard, ears forward, then sharply back. The muscles along her neck tightened beneath Sergei's fingers. He saw the change ripple through her body before he even heard the car door shut. He set the bandage down. "It's all right," he said, though the words were for both of them now. Outside, a second door opened, then a third. More than one visitor. That was deliberate. Everything men like Oleg Zhdanov did was deliberate. Sergei walked to the barn entrance and looked out across the yard. The sky hung low and metallic. Snowmelt gathered in the wheel ruts. The farmhouse looked smaller than usual under the presence of that black vehicle parked near the gate, as if wealth itself had the power to shrink poorer things merely by standing next to them. Zhdanov stepped away from the SUV with the same polished calm he had worn at the courthouse square in Chapter 1. Only now the smile had not yet cracked. He was dressed for city weather, not farm weather. Dark coat, leather gloves, scarf folded neatly, shoes unsuited for mud. Beside him stood a narrow-faced lawyer carrying a slim briefcase and the expression of a man who had built his life on signatures rather than consequences. A third man remained by the vehicle, broad-shouldered, watchful, the same kind of silence Sergei had learned to distrust. Not a visit, a performance. Belyanka shifted inside the stall behind him, ate one hoof striking once against wood. Zhdanov's gaze went instantly past Sergei toward the barn interior. There it was, the brief flash of recognition, not affection, not concern, just calculation colliding with inconvenience. He had expected a corpse long ago. What he found instead was a living problem with a white coat and a pulse. "Mr. Rudnev," he said, as if they were meeting under civilized terms, "I thought it best we speak privately before this turns into something unpleasant." Sergei did not move from the doorway. "It already is." That answer landed more cleanly than Zhdanov expected. Sergei saw it in the fractional pause, the tiny reset of the smile. The lawyer stepped forward first, perhaps hoping paperwork would soften the moral ugliness of the moment. He opened the briefcase, removed several documents, and held them not out to Sergei but slightly upward, where they could be seen and admired. "My client," he said, "is prepared to resolve this matter generously." Generously. Like the word hung there with the same sterile indecency as disinfectant on rot. Sergei said nothing. From the road behind the fence he noticed motion. Yelena, of course. Carrying a basket, she no longer even pretended to be delivering. She slowed at the gate, took one look at the car, and remained exactly where she was, far enough away not to be invited in, close enough to witness what decency might later require her to testify about. Zhdanov turned his palms slightly outward, the practiced posture of a reasonable man offering unreasonable terms with charm. "You purchased an animal under false circumstances," he said. "I'm willing to assume you didn't know that." "I know enough now." "Then let's save each other time." Zhdanov nodded to the lawyer, who produced an envelope thick enough to mean insult in any language. "You return the horse. We compensate you for your trouble. More than compensate you." The lawyer named a number. For one suspended second, even the yard seemed to listen. It was more money than Sergei had held in years. More than enough to repair the roof, replace the stove, buy feed through winter, pay the stonecutter, put a proper marker over Anna's grave, Enough to change the daily physics of his life. Zhdanov watched him carefully as the figure settled in the air. Men like him believed all integrity had a price. They simply enjoyed discovering it. Inside the barn, Belyanka blew sharply through her nostrils. Sergei did not look at the envelope. She stays. No heat, no performance, just fact. The lawyer glanced at Zhdanov. Zhdanov's smile thinned, but only slightly. "Mr. Rudnev," he said, "you are an old man on a failing farm. Let's not turn this into a fantasy about justice. You found something valuable by accident. That does not make it yours." Sergei's eyes rested on him with the grave patience of a man who had buried too much to be impressed by expensive certainty. "I found a dying horse," he said. "The valuable part was still alive when your people left her to disappear. That was the first real strike. It landed because it was simple. Truth, when spoken plainly, often humiliates lies more deeply than shouting ever could." The broad-shouldered man by the vehicle shifted. The lawyer's jaw tightened, and Zhdanov, for the first time, stopped pretending this was merely a clerical misunderstanding. He looked around the yard then, at the warped fence, the patched porch, the sagging edge of the barn roof, the split woodpile, the hard-earned poverty of a man who had never learned how to make himself appear less poor than he was. His gaze moved to the farmhouse window, then to the kitchen table inside, visible faintly through the glass. There, near the lamp, lay the folded paper from the stone cutter and the faded photograph Sergei had forgotten to put away. And because cruelty in certain men was not impulsive but surgical, Zhdanov understood exactly where to cut. He tilted his head toward the window as though making some small, almost sympathetic observation. "You need the money," he said softly. "Take it. Buy your wife a better grave. At least make her look respected." The yard went still. Not quiet. Still. Yelena, at the gate, inhaled so sharply it was almost a cry. The lawyer did not react outwardly, but even he did not look pleased. There are lines. Men cross differently when they are writing documents and when they are standing in front of what those documents destroy. Sergei did not answer at first. His face changed so little that a stranger might have missed it. But the grief in him, long disciplined, long contained, moved once beneath the surface like something old and deep turning in cold water. Inside the barn, Belyanka took one step forward and stopped behind him, close enough that he could feel her presence without touching her, protective, watching. Then, as if even she understood that some violence leaves no mark on flesh and is still violence. When Sergei finally spoke, his voice was quiet enough to force every other sound in the yard to kneel. "You do not get to speak her name." There was no tremor in it now. That was what made it dangerous. Zhdanov held his gaze for a second longer than necessary. Then the charm died completely. "Fine," he said. No smile, no civility, just the naked machinery underneath. "You want the ugly version?" He stepped one pace closer, shoes sinking slightly into the thawing mud. "That horse is registered property. I have documents. I have attorneys. I have witnesses who can place the transfer under unlawful circumstances. I can bury you in procedure before you understand the first page. I can make the cost of keeping her destroy you long before a judge ever rules." He let that settle. Then he added, colder now, "And when that happens, you'll still lose the horse." Sergei had known this was coming. Not the exact words, but the shape of it. Money first, then humiliation, and then pressure disguised as inevitability. Men who mistook power for legitimacy always followed the same map. "She stays," Sergei repeated. Zhdanov's eyes flicked toward the barn, toward the white mare half-shadowed in the doorway. Something ugly tightened there. Not fear yet, but offense. The offense of a man unaccustomed to refusal from those he considered structurally insignificant. "You are protecting evidence you don't understand," he said. That sentence slipped out too easily. The lawyer turned his head slightly. So did Sergei. A beat too late, Zhdanov realized what he had revealed. Not ownership, knowledge. The kind of knowledge a legitimate owner should not have needed to phrase that way. From the gate, Yelena spoke for the first time. Funny thing to say about a horse you supposedly just want returned. All three men turned. She stood with her basket crooked against her hip, blue coat buttoned to the chin. Its expression sharpened into something that made her look less like a widow selling eggs and more like the worst possible witness a liar could encounter in a small village. Zhdanov dismissed her with one glance. "And you are?" "Someone local," Yelena said, "meaning I know what honest looks like around here." The broad-shouldered man near the SUV took a step away from the vehicle. Sergei noticed. So did Belyanka. She pinned her ears and shifted her weight, a tremor running through her body. Not random. Recognition again. Sergei took one hand behind him without looking and found the edge of her neck. Easy. The contact steadied her. Zhdanov seemed to make a decision then. If charm had failed and pressure had not yet cracked the old man, perhaps threat required illustration. He nodded once to the broad-shouldered man. Too subtle for city people, not too subtle for Sergei. The man moved toward the barn. Only 2 steps, no more, but intent lives in movement long before action arrives. Belyanka exploded forward with a scream of terror so raw it cut the air apart. She slammed against the stall rail, striking once with a front hoof, eyes rolled wide, breath tearing out of her. Sergei moved instantly, putting his body between her and the advancing man. "Back," he said. The word cracked across the yard like an axe on frozen wood. The man stopped, not out of respect, because even hired men know sometimes when a line, once crossed, will make the entire situation uglier than the money justifies. Yelena dropped the basket. Eggs cracked in the mud. She did not even look down. "You touch that horse," she said, voice rising now, "and every house between here and the square will hear about it before sunset." The broad-shouldered man hesitated. Zhdanov lifted a hand. The man stepped back again. Cowardice and caution often wear the same face from a distance. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Only Belyanka's breathing filled the barn. Ragged, fast, the breathing of memory dragged violently to the surface. Oh, and in that breathing, in the mare's horror, in the tiny mistake Zhdanov had already made with his own words, Sergei understood something essential. This was no longer a dispute over value. It was a containment problem for a rich man whose dead horse had refused to stay dead. Zhdanov adjusted one glove. When he spoke again, his calm had returned, but it was no longer elegant. It had become colder, more efficient. "You are making a mistake you cannot afford," he said. Sergei answered without hesitation. "Maybe." That seemed to irritate Zhdanov more than defiance would have. Because honest men are hard to frighten once they stop imagining they can keep what matters by compromise. The lawyer gathered the papers. The envelope never left his hand. "This will proceed formally," he said. "It already is," Sergei replied. Zhdanov turned away first. Mud touched the edge of his expensive shoe, and he looked down at it as if offended by the existence of Earth itself. And then he walked back to the SUV. Before getting in, he glanced once more toward the barn, toward Sergei, toward Belyanka, not with defeat, with calculation unfinished. The engine started. The vehicle backed out, turned, disappeared down the lane. Only after the sound faded did the yard begin to breathe again. Yelena crossed it quickly, boots splashing through meltwater, anger flushing her face bright under the cold. That filthy. She stopped herself, perhaps out of respect for Anna's memory lingering somewhere in the yard, perhaps because no curse she knew felt sufficient. Inside the barn, Sergei stood beside Belyanka until the trembling eased, her breathing slowed by fractions, then by more. He stroked the side of her neck once, twice, not soothing her with lies, only reminding her with touch and rhythm that the danger had passed for this hour. Yelena leaned into the doorway. "You heard what he said. He's going to come harder next time." "I know. And that man with him, that was no lawyer's errand boy." "I know." She looked at him then with the exhausted fury of someone who had watched kindness become expensive too many times in life. "You're not alone in this." Sergei did not thank her. Some loyalties are insulted by gratitude spoken too formally. He only nodded. That night, the temperature dropped again. Ice formed thin over puddles in the yard. Sergei checked the barn latch before supper, after supper, and once more before bed. On the third check, he stopped. The latch had been scratched. Not broken. Not forced open. Tested. Metal marked fresh along the edge. Wood shaved near the staple as though someone had tried the weakness of it with a tool and then thought better of finishing the job. Yelena, who had refused to go home before dark and now stood on the porch wrapping her scarf tighter, saw his face change. "What?" Sergei touched the metal. Cold. Fresh. Someone came back. She followed him into the yard, saw the damage, and went pale beneath her fury. Within the hour, Deputy Mikhail Antonov arrived from the village, coat half-buttoned, notebook already out. He was not a dramatic man. That was one reason Sergei trusted him. He listened before he spoke, looked before he concluded. The kind of decent official small towns survived on without praising enough. He studied the latch, the tire marks still faint near the lane, the yard, the barn. Then he stood and looked Sergei in the eye. "We document everything," he said. "Times, cars, visitors, threats. We don't guess. We prove." From inside the stall, Belyanka shifted once against the straw. Mikhail glanced toward her. "And we keep her here." "For now?" Yelena asked. "For as long as the law gives me room," he said. It was not a comforting answer. It was better. It was honest. He had just finished noting the scratch pattern on the latch when Sergei's phone rang inside the kitchen. All three of them looked toward the house. Sergei went in first and picked up on the second ring. Darya did not waste words. Her voice came low, tight, sharpened by the sound of paper and urgency in the background. "Sergei," she said, "I found something in Zhdanov's insurance trail." A pause. Then the sentence that pulled the whole story one turn tighter. "And it's worse than we thought." Dawn came to the courthouse without tenderness. The sky over the village was a sheet of pale iron. Snowmelt had frozen again in the night, turning the stone steps slick and shining. Breath drifted white from every mouth in the square. People gathered in clusters, collars turned up, boots shifting against the cold, their voices low with the grave excitement of those who knew they were about to witness more than a legal hearing. They were about to witness a reckoning. By the time Sergei arrived, the crowd had already parted in the subtle way crowds do when pity and respect begin to look the same. He came on foot from the lower road, shoulders squared under his old coat, the lines in his face sharper from weeks of strain and too little sleep. Beside him walked Belyanka. She no longer looked like the discarded ghost he had led home from the market. The change was not flashy, not magical. Healing rarely is. Her ribs were still faintly visible, but no longer like accusations. Her coat had regained a muted pearl shine beneath the winter dust. The wound in her hind leg still stiffened her stride, yet she carried herself with a quiet, gathering dignity, as if the body that had once been sentenced to disappearance had slowly remembered it had been built for more than pain. Still, memory remained inside her. Sergei felt it in the way her ears moved too quickly at engine sounds, in the way she measured doorways, in the way her breathing shortened whenever strange men closed distance too fast. He kept one hand near her neck as they climbed the last incline toward the courthouse. Not holding, just there. The same way he had stood beside her in the barn the first night she woke, fighting ghosts no one else could see. At the steps, Yelena was already waiting, wrapped in her blue coat, chin high, and eyes sharp with the furious loyalty of someone who had not chosen this fight but had accepted it completely. Beside her stood Deputy Mikhail Antonov, collar up, notebook tucked under one arm, expression set into the steady practicality that made frightened people breathe easier without understanding why. Daria arrived moments later carrying a leather folder thick with printed records and copies. There were dark shadows under her eyes. She had earned every one of them. "You slept?" Yelena asked. "Not enough to start lying," Daria said. Mikhail gave Sergei a brief nod. "We're in better shape than we were 3 days ago." Sergei looked toward the courthouse doors. "Are we in good shape?" Mikhail took a second before answering. "No," he said, "but we are in true shape." Strangely, that helped, because truth, unlike reassurance, did not collapse when tested. Across the square, a black SUV rolled to a stop. Nobody had to say the name, but the vehicle seemed to say it on its own. Oleg Zhdanov stepped out first, all polished edges and expensive restraint. His coat was darker than the morning. His scarf sat perfectly at the throat. His face carried the calm of a man who had spent his whole life mistaking influence for inevitability. Behind him came the lawyer, slim briefcase in hand, and another man from the legal team Sergei hadn't seen before. Older, silver-haired, with the hard patience of someone hired precisely because he knew how to dress theft in the language of procedure. Zhdanov looked across the square and found Sergei immediately. Then his eyes went to Belyanka. Something cold moved behind his expression. Not affection, not regret, only the irritation of a lie that had grown legs and walked itself into daylight. Courtrooms have their own weather. Even before people speak, the air inside them learns what kind of battle is coming. That morning, the hearing room was overheated and tense, with long windows gathering weak light and benches creaking beneath the weight of neighbors pretending they had only come to handle errands nearby. Papers shuffled. Coats came off. A clerk organized files with crisp efficiency. Up front, the judge reviewed the case materials with the dispassionate face of a man who had seen too many human beings confuse ownership with morality. He was not sentimental. That would matter. When the hearing began, Zhdanov's team moved first, as men like him always preferred. The silver-haired attorney spoke with elegant precision. Registered property, unauthorized transfer, unlawful retention, emotional manipulation, rural misunderstanding. He laid the words out like polished silverware, each one designed to make cruelty look administrative. He presented registration copies bearing Lyrika's name, breed records, valuation statements, archived correspondence. Then came the most dangerous element, confidence. Because documents, even false or incomplete ones, often sound more legitimate than kindness in a room built for paper. Sergei's lawyer, an overworked legal aid attorney Daria had managed to bring in from the district center, did not try to outshine them. She was younger than the others, plain-spoken, tired, and very aware that the facts themselves would have to do the heavy lifting. Her name was Elena Sokolov, and she possessed the valuable habit of never using 12 words where 5 honest ones would survive. She began with abandonment, with neglect, with the condition of the horse at purchase, with the illegitimacy of a claim arriving only after recovery made the animal valuable again. But before any of that could settle fully, the judge requested a brief recess to examine the supplementary records Daria had filed late the night before. That was when the moment outside the courtroom happened. Yet the corridor beyond the chamber opened onto a side courtyard, cold, narrow, bordered by a waist-high stone wall filmed with frost. Belyanka waited there with Sergei while the officials reviewed the paperwork. Mikhail stood a few feet away. Yelena hovered at the entrance despite 2 polite suggestions that she did not technically need to remain in the immediate area. Zhdanov exited the courtroom with his attorneys and saw the mayor. He slowed. Something in him appeared to decide that the old script might still work, that possession, performed firmly enough, could reassert itself in front of witnesses. that perhaps the horse, being an animal, might obey some last remnant of former control and rescue the image he was beginning to lose. He stepped forward with measured confidence. "Lyrica," he said. The name struck the air like a command from another life. Belyanka froze. Not the stillness of attention, the stillness of impact. Her head came high. Her eye showed white. Every line of her body tightened so suddenly that Sergei felt the change before he saw it. Zhdanov extended one gloved hand, palm down, as though summoning back an investment temporarily misplaced. And Belyanka recoiled, as if he had opened fire. Her hooves scraped hard against stone. Her body swung sideways, nearly colliding with the wall. Breath burst from her in ragged, terrified blasts. Ears flat. Neck arched in pure defense. She did not go toward him. She fought for distance from him. Voices rose behind them. The judge, coming out with the clerk just in time to witness the reaction, stopped short. Zhdanov's hand remained suspended for one absurd second before he lowered it. "She's agitated," he said quickly. "The environment." But Sergei had already stepped beside her. He did not seize the halter. He did not drag her close. He simply turned his shoulder toward her and spoke the name she had come back to life under. Belyanka. The mare moved at once, not toward safety in general, toward him, and she pressed against his side so hard he had to widen his stance to brace for her weight. Her trembling ran through his coat into his bones. Her breathing remained wild, but she anchored herself to him with the blind urgency of something that knew exactly where danger ended. A murmur went through the corridor. Not triumph. Not yet. Something deeper. Recognition. The judge looked from the horse to Zhdanov to Sergei and said nothing at all. That silence mattered more than any gasp, because he was not a man who mistook drama for evidence. And yet what he had just seen opened a question the paperwork alone had not answered. Why would a lawfully owned horse react to her owner like a survivor seeing the source of trauma? Back inside, the hearing resumed. The silver-haired attorney tried at once to neutralize the moment. "With respect, Your Honor, animal behavior is inherently variable. Fear responses prove nothing." The judge folded his hands. "I agree," he said. The room stilled, and for half a second Sergei felt the ground beneath the case tilt dangerously. Then the judge continued. "But behavior can justify closer scrutiny when it conflicts sharply with the narrative presented. So let us scrutinize." That was the turn. Small, exact, irreversible. He called Deputy Mikhail Antonov first. Mikhail testified without flourish. Dates, times, observations. The black SUV seen near Sergei's property on multiple evenings after the microchip identification. The fresh scratches on the barn latch. The timing of the intimidation visits. Yelena's corroboration about the vehicle slowing near the road twice before Zhdanov's direct appearance. No guesses, no outrage, only sequence. Truth built like stone. Then Yelena took the stand. She was not polished, thank God. Polished witnesses often sound borrowed. Yelena sounded real. She described the day at the market when Sergei bought the mare. Her condition. The seller's indifference. The fact that no one in the village had ever seen that horse before. The black car later on the road. Zhdanov's visit to the farm. The insulting remark about Anna's grave. At that, Zhdanov's attorney objected. The judge allowed it in limited form, not as proof of ownership, but as evidence of coercive conduct and witness credibility. Yelena looked directly at the bench and said, "Men who tell the truth don't usually need to step on the dead to win." No one forgot that line. Then came Daria, and with her the case stopped being emotional and became deadly. She explained the microchip scan, the registration history, the identity match. Lyrica, rare English thoroughbred, owner of record Oleg Zhdanov. Then she laid down the records she had spent nights chasing through veterinary contacts, insurance databases, and archive filings. The horse had been declared dead. Not missing, not transferred. Dead. The declared cause had been injury-related decline following a transport incident. Insurance payout processed within 10 days. Supporting documents included a veterinary statement whose timestamp did not match the clinic server's original log. The examining veterinarian listed on one form had been out of the country on the date recorded. A transport notation referenced disposal through an approved channel, yet no disposal confirmation existed. No carcass identification photos had been filed. No body weight record at death. No cremation certificate. No burial confirmation. Not paperwork. A performance of paperwork. Daria's voice stayed level as she explained each inconsistency. "This is not what legitimate equine death processing looks like," she said. "It looks like a horse was injured, declared dead on paper prematurely, monetized through insurance, and then physically removed through unregulated sale channels before the falsehood could be challenged." The room held perfectly still. Zhdanov's silver-haired attorney rose and attacked from the only angle left. Uncertainty. "Doctor, are you stating under oath that my client personally falsified these records?" "No," Daria answered. "I'm stating that the records are inconsistent with reality, and that the living horse attached to those records is standing outside the courtroom." That answer struck harder than accusation, because it refused drama, because it left nowhere soft for a lie to land. Elena Sokolov, Sergei's attorney, then introduced the final hinge point: abandonment, followed by coercive reclamation. Even if the original registration had once been legitimate, lawful ownership had been compromised by fraudulent death declaration, unlawful disposal, and subsequent intimidation toward the good faith rescuer who paid value, provided care, and preserved the animal's life when the titled owner had already profited from her supposed death. As in simpler words, he called her dead when she was still alive. He got paid. Then he came back only when someone else made her worth having again. By then, even the judge's expression had changed. Not into anger, into clarity. That was worse for Zhdanov. Anger can be redirected. Clarity cannot. When Zhdanov finally took the stand, he tried dignity first. Administrative misunderstanding. Rogue intermediaries, clerical confusion, overeager staff, miscommunication between transport personnel and insurers. At one point, he even suggested that Sergei, by refusing immediate return, had complicated what might otherwise have been professionally resolved. The judge let him speak, then asked one question. "If you believed the horse to be lawfully yours and living, why was she declared dead for insurance purposes before any verified physical confirmation of death?" For the first time all day, Oleg Zhdanov had no elegant answer ready. There was a pause. Small. Fatal. He began speaking of delegated processes, internal reviews, incomplete reports. The judge stopped him with a raised hand. That was the end of the performance. The ruling, when it came, was not theatrical. It was exact. Pending formal fraud investigation, the court found Zhdanov's ownership claim unenforceable due to material evidence of abandonment, false death declaration, compromised documentation, and coercive post-recovery conduct. Temporary lawful custody subject to final administrative conversion would remain with Sergei Pavlovich Rudnev, who had acquired the mare in good faith, preserved her life, and cooperated fully with authorities. The insurance file and related records were to be referred immediately for criminal review. No cheering followed. This was not that kind of room. But something moved through it all the same. Relief. Sharp, stunned, almost painful relief. Zhdanov sat very still as the words landed. His face remained composed. Almost. Only around the mouth did the composure fail, just enough to reveal what had been living underneath his polish all along. Not confidence, panic in a tailored coat. He left under escort of procedure, not handcuffs, not yet. But his exit had changed shape. He no longer looked like a man arriving to reclaim property. He looked like a man realizing the lie that had enriched him had finally learned how to speak. By the time Sergei stepped back into the courtyard, the cold felt different. Belyanka turned her head toward him before he reached her. He laid a hand on her neck. "She stays," Yelena said, as if testing the sentence for reality. "She stays," Mikhail confirmed. Darya exhaled for what might have been the first time all week. Sergei said nothing. Some victories entered too deep for language at first. The next morning, the farm woke under clear light. Thin gold spilled across the yard. Frost shone on the fence rails. Smoke lifted from the chimney in a straight, untroubled line. In the barn, a fresh straw glowed softly beneath the stall window. Sergei stood at the door with a small wooden sign in his hand. He had sanded it himself the night before, slowly, after the hearing, by lamplight. The letters were simple. Belyanka. He fixed it above the stall. No speech, no ceremony. Just the quiet claiming of a new normal. Inside, she lifted her head from the feed trough and watched him. Warm water steamed in the bucket. Her blanket sat folded nearby for evening. The wound on her leg had closed cleanly now, leaving a scar instead of an emergency. Her eye still held caution. Maybe it always would. But it also held something else now. Expectation. Routine. Home. Sergei stepped inside and rested his forehead briefly against hers. He thought of Anna, of the long empty years after her death, of the bread he had put back on the market table, of the first terrible night in the barn, of the cold square outside the courthouse, of all the ordinary, stubborn acts that had carried them here. People like to call such endings miracles, but miracles were too clean a word for what this had cost. This had been patience, hunger, refusal, witnesses who chose courage over convenience, a doctor who kept digging, a deputy who documented instead of looking away, a widow who would not shut up when silence became immoral, and an old farmer who had looked at a dying horse in a forgotten corner of the market and recognized somehow that saving her might be the only way left to save himself. Belyanka breathed once against his cheek. Outside, the day brightened. He opened the stall door. She stepped into the yard carefully, favoring the old injury only slightly now. Sunlight touched her white coat. She went a few paces ahead, then stopped and turned, not nervous, not lost, simply waiting. For him. Sergei came to stand beside her, and in that plain morning light, with the barn behind them and no one left to take either of them away, the world looked at last like it had room for both of them.